will see the slides here. And the computer is there for you.
Martina confirmed slides are ready to go, and Alicia is apparently in the building.
Okay,
So she's
amazing. Yeah, well, good. Hey, going.
Should I just start?
So you can just start speaking, say something not so important first, and they'll turn on the mic.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. Please take a seat. So yesterday we had a pretty busy day, fantastic plenary session and parallel session, and very late, but I think everybody was very energized. Thanks for coming early this morning. We have a very simple task this morning. We need to rewrite the future of industrial strategy. So we have an hour and 15 minutes for that. And industrial policy, industrial strategy, if you think about it, and if you've been in this game for some time, was almost always like a dirty word, at least for the past 30 years, and especially in the European context. Meanwhile, China came up with this 10-year strategic plan focusing on key strategic technologies and now sitting on top of pretty much all of them, all the key strategic technology from EVs, robotics, semiconductor. We've seen the US in the recent years focusing aggressively on some elements of supply chain resilience, reshoring, remanufacturing, and also dominating in some key industrial technologies. So today, what we see is that industrial strategy is really back on top of the agenda, also back on top of the European agenda. The Draghi report is now 18 months old. A lot has been said on the urgency of also what needs to be done, a bit less on how to do it exactly, and that's going to be the topic of today's session. But also, there is an additional level of complexity. So essentially, the global context has changed, and it's changing, even over the weekend, it keeps changing pretty much overnight. And we have a geopolitical fragmentation, a very strong AI-driven transformation, green transition, a massive competitive gap that doesn't seem to be unfolding in the right way. So this session really want to ask what a new industrial strategy look like, and can Europe design one bolder, faster, and smarter enough? So let me first introduce our first keynote speaker, Ricardo Hausmann. It's my great pleasure to welcome Ricardo, who is the director of the Growth Lab at the Harvard Kennedy School, one of the most influential economists today, also served as Minister of Planning of Venezuela, and the chief economist of the Inter-American Development Bank. And his research on economic complexity in particular that he pioneered has been used by governments all over the world as a basis for industrial strategy. So, Ricardo, please, my great pleasure to welcome you on stage for this first keynote.
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me back to this Ideas Lab. And they told me that I had 12 minutes, which for Latin American is really a tough thing to do. Let me say that to begin with, how do I approach this topic? I approach it as a Europhile. I'm rooting for Europe. My mother was born in Anderlecht, here nearby, and I think that the world will be a better place if Europe were much more powerful, including a military superpower. And I think that that's not going to happen unless you have a much stronger political authority at the European level. And I also think that industrial policy, it's not whether, but how. So I'm going to try to say things about the how, more than about the whether it should be done or not. Now, industrial policy is back. Nan and Danny Roderick documented about 2,300 industrial policy actions in the advanced countries and China, 70% involving some kind of trade distortion, 48% coming from China, 108 billion in OECD country monies deployed. So it is there. So it's not the question of whether, it's a question of how to do it well. I would like to remind ourselves of what Wittgenstein said about problems in philosophy. He said that problems in philosophy are often problems in language. If you clean up the language, philosophical problems go away. So I'm going to say industrial policy is any policy that addresses some kind of narrow sectors or with some target sectors to essentially increase their output. Now, in the process of industrial policy, you use many ingredients. So there are a lot of ingredients, from production tax credits to investment credits, grants, public procurement, local content requirement, R&D funding, demonstration, test beds, etc. There are many ingredients. And there are many papers in the literature on trying to figure out whether the ingredients work. And I think all those papers are wrong. Because they're trying to answer the question, are onions good? And you might say, in what dish? So if you tell me, in an omelet, maybe they're good, right? In coffee, they're not good, right? So it's not, you cannot evaluate ingredients. You have to evaluate the dish. And industrial policy is always a dish. It's a combination of things. And that's why comparing across policies just by what happened to ingredients, I don't think is the proper way to do it. Now, the reason, the fact that it's urgent, as Pierre-Alex said, and we want it to be forceful and so on, it's no excuse to stop thinking. And as economists, we have to try to get our minds around what is the nature of the distortion that we think we are targeting. And those distortions can be many. One of them is that any new technology, any new activity is going to require a set of public goods that are probably not there. When they invented cars, they needed roads, they needed traffic lights, they needed traffic signs, they needed traffic rules, they needed traffic cops, right? So that technology is going to live in an ecosystem of public goods. If we cannot coordinate the appearance of the public goods with the appearance of the technology, the stuff doesn't deploy. That's one of the reasons why there isn't a single kilometer of high-speed rail in the US, right? It's not, the market won't do it, right? So coordinating the public goods that are complementary, there won't be no EVs unless there's charging stations. So you don't want to give the money to the EV companies. You want to make sure that the charging stations are there. If they're there, then they will sell, right? So those are coordination failures. So if there are coordination failures, let's spell them out. If there are learning spillovers, or there's just a learning curve, it may escape the firm itself, it may move throughout the value chain, and then then costs will be coming down over time, but you have to get there through accumulated production. There may be other kinds of externalities. There may be issues of security and resilience and sovereignty, right? Where you might be willing to pay more for something that is not going to be a choke point where some external power is going to extort you with. So all of these reasons are fine. They need to be spelled out because each one of them might be addressed with some kind of different ingredient, and they will always appear in combinations, in complex combinations of things. So how do you address that? I think that what you don't want to do is to agree that everything is going to be dealt with the same ingredient. Every problem is going to be very different. And you have to have the organizational capacity to figure out the difference between every context. So in my mind, the way to think of this analytically is that production requires many inputs. Some of those inputs can be purchased in markets. Other of those inputs are provided by governments. Some of those inputs might be the ability to coordinate within the private sector itself when there are private sector failures. So The things that can be purchased in markets, they benefit from the invisible hand. There's an invisible hand that's going to, demand goes up, supply is going to respond somehow. But things provided by governments don't have the invisible hand. Industrial policy is, to a large extent, to have the capacity to respond to a visible hand because the invisible hand is not there. Now, I'm going to try to think about what does that entail. Now, the moment you think about fiscal policy, you have to think about, of industrial policy, you have to think about the governance of that industrial policy. And this is where many of the issues come up, right? So, from the start, I would like to say that production is here to fund the state. Production is not here to be funded by the state. So, production cannot be on the liability side of governments. It has to be on the asset side of governments. So if you want to have an EV industry and so on, you want that EV industry to contribute to the fisc. You don't want that industry to live off the fisc, okay? So there has to be an element of discipline. Then there is the problem of capture and political economy. Subsidy races. There is a problem of implementation capability, and there's a problem of potential retaliation. So all of these issues are involved in the way you design your policy. I'm going to make a proposal of how to organize industrial policy. Please tolerate my ignorance of Europe. So probably Europe is organized in slightly different ways. I'm only thinking theoretically, okay? As you know, we know that, as they say, people know that things work in theory and they wonder if they work in practice. Economists see things working in practice and they wonder if they work in theory. So I want to see if what would my theory say about how to do it. We need a disciplined process, because otherwise this can go haywire. Everybody will invent a new reason why they are strategic. As they say, when everybody uses the word strategic, put your hand in your wallet, right? So I would say you have to fund only things that are going to be positive in net present value terms for the fisc, okay? So it's a very important discipline. Only projects where you can argue that in net present value terms, it will be positive for the fisc. There might be outlays at the beginning or whatever, but you're expecting to get the money back. It's a tough standard because, at most, I don't know, the government taxes 25%, 30%, so you need to make at least $3 of extra, $4 of extra income to get $1 back. So it's a tough measure, I understand it, but I think it's an interesting discipline, because you're telling other people who, in all the fight around the budget, forget about the budget. This is going to be a net contribution to the budget. So let's not fight over the budget, but let's, in exchange for that, we'll accept this very significant discipline. Now, the next question you want to ask yourself is, what does the person or the entity, the organization managing industrial policy know? And here, I'm going to kind of start by theoretically saying, okay, suppose that this entity knows everything and is capable of doing everything. So what would that organization do? It would, since it knows everything, it would look at all ideas that have positive net present value, and we'll do all of them. All ideas that have positive net present value for the fisc. And for example, at the top of that, it may be the single market, because the single market doesn't cost much, it could generate growth, and it would be positive for governments. Governments, in the end, are equity holders on everything in the economy, right? So that means that industrial policy need not be something different from a single market. It might be the single market might be a way of implementing a part of that industrial policy. Now, if you have a limited budget, now you need to prioritize, okay? And then you will prioritize by ranking things in terms of how big is their net present value impact per dollar of outlay. So that would give you, if you have limited budget, that would give you sort of like a prioritization rule. Number 3, what happens if there's uncertainty? You just don't know, what are things going to happen, but you have some idea of how things are going to happen. And there, obviously, you would like diversification. So you would want a diversified portfolio. You would not want to have, a single bet for the whole union, right? And the final one is, what if you have an organization that doesn't have the capability to do industrial policy well, but it can acquire that capability over time? Okay, then it means that if you invested in that capability, you would be able to extract more value later on. So that organization would also need to invest in its own learning. And maybe part of that learning is learning by doing. So you want this organization to be accumulating knowledge through its experience of what works, what doesn't work, how to get things done, and so on. And so I think seen from this way, you can have your own priorities, and we can have this meeting to decide what the priorities for Europe are. And since I'm not European, I will leave that to you. But my take is that priorities can be endogenous. Let people nominate priorities, but you have a disciplined process on how to process them. Focus on, when you want to achieve a goal, start focusing on cheap things, and especially things that the government is already doing to prevent those things from happening. It's not that you're going to have a pot of money to substitute for bad policies, right? You want to start from a first best to see if, clean up your policies. And I think in that sense that would be in line with a common market, with a single market. You need an organization that is able to learn on the job, and for that you need independence. And independence is going to be also excellent for the political economy problem, right? That you want to have an entity that is accountable for the net present value to the public sector, right? And that disciplines that organization. So it will be a source of revenue for the government, and in doing it at the European level may facilitate the single market. So it might be a complement to a single market. Let me stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ricardo. Thank you. And Ricardo reminded us that it's not because action in terms of industrial strategy is urgent that we need to stop thinking. And our next speaker has been thinking a lot and making really wonderful contribution on how to measure and also how we misread modern economies. And essentially will now present some work on industrial strategy in the context of the AI transformation. So please join me in welcoming Diane Cole, who is Professor of Public Policy at the University of Cambridge. Thank you so much, Diane.
Thank you. Gosh, Ricardo is a hard act to follow, but actually he laid the foundations for what I'm going to talk about very nicely, so thank you for that, Ricardo. I have some slides. Let's see if I can get them moving. Here we go. Why do we need an industrial policy for AI? So my research for decades now, since the 1990s, has been about the digital economy and AI. So it's great at my age to find that what I'm doing has really come back into fashion. We are in a period of technology transition in both AI, digital technologies, and energy technologies. We've had, in the past couple of years, the arrival of commercial products for generative AI. Every time I've been to Silicon Valley in the past 2 or 3 years, the engineers are themselves quite surprised by how quickly the capabilities of the models are advancing. So we have this structural shift. And whenever this happens, decisions taken by private investors, by governments around policies, will shape the structure, the production structure of the economy for decades to come. play into that the geopolitics, which I don't really need to labor at the moment, but suffice it to say that the supply chains that have been put in place in the past 40 or 50 years in the context of the old international order are now looking very vulnerable, and a lot of thought needs to be given to those supply chain structures. And then above all, as the chart shows, productivity growth has slowed down. This is called a puzzle by economists because we see the amazing technical changes, and yet none of that is showing through in productivity growth. I'd go beyond the growth figures to say, actually, markets are not working well for normal people. And that's not just technology markets, but markets in insurance and financial products, in energy, in healthcare. In many ways, people feel that the system, the market system, is not working for them. And we see that reflected in populist votes, anti-establishment votes in many countries. I mean, there's no reason now why people here should follow what's going on in UK politics, but the two main parties that have dominated politics for decades are no longer the main parties. It's an extraordinary context. So I think that what we're seeing is the rather messy end of what people have called the neoliberal era. And that includes in the United States, where I've seen what's happening being described as state capitalism with American characteristics. So at a time like this, it's really folly for governments not to think strategically about what's happening in the economy and the supply side of the economy. So that includes in AI. And the chart shows the advance in the frontier of the American models and the Chinese models. And so this idea that there's an arms race at the frontier between the US and China is very deep-seated. China has been focusing on the frontier models, but it's got a very interesting type of strategy. In a sense, they're competing past each other because China has focused on open models, not proprietary models. It has focused on applications and not just the frontier. And if you think about it, China has an end-to-end energy policy as well, from the photovoltaic cells and renewables all the way through to the products that use the energy, the AI products themselves. Where is Europe here? And how can we think about European economies catching up in this race? And it looks kind of hopeless if you shape it as a frontier race of this kind. And so thinking about policy in Europe needs to be more sophisticated. As Ricardo said, there's no substitute for thinking. Can we think about particular bets? Are there areas of technology where the European advantage in research can be turned into commercial strength as well? Are there potential coalitions that enable Europeans to match the scale that's needed for some of the investments? We have in Airbus an earlier example of a cooperative model that worked very well at European scale. It had the advantage of there being a clear market gap for it to move into, so commercial success came early. That needs to be thought about carefully. But those are the kinds of opportunities that Europeans could be thinking about, not to race at the frontier in this way, but to successfully deploy commercial AI technologies. It's certainly feasible. I think one of the big challenges is the attitude about what's possible and understanding that this is a strategic context, that the ground is shifting, and that there is an opportunity as well as a challenge there for policy thinking. How much are we using AI at the moment? The real answer is we don't really know, but what we do know is that use is ahead in the United States, which is what this chart shows. The blue bars are US usage by companies as reflected in surveys reported by the census in the US and Eurostat. So it's large companies use AI more than small companies. It's uneven by company size. It's very uneven by sector. So the tech sector is unsurprisingly one of the biggest users, followed by professional services. There's starting to be some evidence that this is having an impact on productivity. In the macro figures, US productivity is pulling ahead of European productivity. It's happening at the individual level as well. So the kinds of people who use AI, programmers or consultants, are reporting big gains in their personal productivity. So it's less clear yet what's happening in other kinds of organizations and contexts. And we don't really have good evidence about what companies are doing with the AI that they're using. They're reporting yes or no, we use it or we don't, but not so much what are we doing, how are we changing end-to-end processes, how is this going to drive productivity advances. And one of the challenges for AI adoption is that the technology frontier is actually moving incredibly fast. This chart is one that's been used very often to show the length of time you can leave an AI agent to get on with a task autonomously. And that has obviously increased quite dramatically and more since this chart was first published. Scaling laws have been operating so far, so bigger is better. If you have more compute, larger models, more training data, you advance the frontier. And the technological competition among the American AI companies has driven this rapid progress in the frontier. Now, of course, there is a lot of hype. There may be a financial bubble. We might see turmoil in the financial markets, and so that might prove a short-term setback. But the models are there, and the engineers are there. I was in Silicon Valley 2 weeks ago, and again, they're saying it's going to change really quickly very soon in terms of agentic AI. But in terms of economic adoption, it's going much slower, as the previous chart indicated. And there are good reasons for that. Change is slow in organizations. It costs a lot of money to adopt a new technology. Some of this is upfront cost. You have to reorganize, you have to do a process re-engineering to get the full productivity benefits of a fundamental technology like this. You have to change your data architecture to make it work better with the actions that you want the models to do. A lot of companies' data reflects different, an accumulation of data over a long period of time on different systems, and the kind of management categories that they have used in the past, which might not be the ones that they need to use in the future. There are also ongoing costs, and so a lot of companies are quite hesitant about the ongoing fees and compute costs they have to pay to use proprietary AI models. There's the question of market power. It's much easier for large companies, and we've seen concentration in lots of markets, so smaller and medium-sized companies are getting left behind. They just don't have the resources to be able to do this. There are the costs of restructuring. The Draghi report, as Pierre-Alex said, 18 months ago, put the spotlight on the costs of restructuring. This is a chart from a more recent paper showing the costs of restructuring in terms of labor costs in European economies, Scandinavian economies, and the Anglo-Saxon economies, and you can see the disadvantage there. Given the changes, the disruption that's inevitable in the labor market, this is a real disadvantage, and so finding a way to support individual workers while making it possible for firms to change what they do is going to be a priority. Finding the scale-up capital, even in the UK, where venture capital per head is actually higher than in the United States, it's not sufficiently large in scale. It focuses on either seed capital or management buyouts. It's not the right kind of capital, so that's a particular challenge for Europe. The infrastructure, including data and public data, is a point I'm going to come back to a little bit later on. And then the coordination challenge, which Ricardo was talking about. How do you, as a government, think about coordinating the multiple individual decisions that need to be made? And that's all by way of saying change has been slow, and too slow. We need to get this speeded up. The way I find useful to think about this is in terms of what's being called digital public infrastructure. And Ricardo referred to public goods. I like the term infrastructure because it puts the spotlight on investing for the longer term. We are thinking about a context of shaping the structure, the production structure of our economies for decades. And so we're thinking about these long-term investments. And there are lots of coordination challenges here. So one of them is standards, getting the right kinds of standards. The previous wave of digital technologies has seen the companies themselves engineer out compatibility and interoperability. It can be engineered back in, and partly by setting standards. Standards are like creating a single market. And mobile telephony is a great example of how Europe has used standard setting in the past to create a market at scale and coordinate company investments. There are network effects in the kinds of complementary assets you need, from the intangible data assets through the data centers, the investments that companies themselves will make in models, the energy supply that's needed. All of that needs coordination, and there's no point making only one of the types of investments. You've got to invest in the whole network. We are very far behind in thinking about identity, not just for us as individuals using digital services, but also the identity of digital agents. How are they going to be authenticated? How are they going to be trusted? It's a security Wild West in terms of using digital agents at the moment. The data layer I've talked about, it's a key part of public infrastructure. Public statisticians are being defunded, and that's a real mistake for governments at a time when private sector companies are investing a vast amount in their own data resources. You cannot be an effective state if you do not have statistics that tell you what's going on in your economy. And then there's a whole question of the legal infrastructure, the intellectual property, the identity, the contracts operating at AI speed, and so on. Key point is that the private returns to any investment made by a business will depend on the effectiveness of the collective infrastructure, the public infrastructure, or the public goods. And so that completely underlines the point Ricardo was making. Final slide, as I'm almost out of time. How do we think about policy? Well, there are lots of classic industrial policy tools that we can bring into play. Advanced market commitments would be a very effective one in the context of new technologies, funding research and development, setting standards, thinking about public procurement. Competition policy, really important. People often portray industrial policy and competition policy as being in opposition, and in some contexts they may be. But if you don't have an effective competition policy, your industrial policy will fail. You need contestability in these markets because we don't know what shape they should take, we don't know what the best technologies are, we need there to be effective competition among AI companies. Overlaps with trade policy, and in the geopolitical context, that's very difficult. And I don't think anybody has yet figured out how you negotiate the overlaps between industrial policy and trade policy, so open questions there. Labour market flexibility while providing a proper safety net for individual workers when there will be disruption and when people are already fed up about how the market economy is working for them. Learning from mistakes, being able to change policy quickly, the kinds of feedback loops that actually many governments are really bad at implementing for obvious political reasons. And then identifying, for reasons of resilience of the economy and sovereignty, as well as just economic growth, what are the bottlenecks in the supply chains. That's about statistics. We don't know enough about that. That's a really big agenda, but I think it underlines the point that both Ricardo and I have made, that now is really a time for thinking about the long term, and it's now up to the policymakers to go ahead and do it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And of course, what a better case than AI to talk about industrial policy. If you think about any strategic technology, AI is probably the most important one in that case. Also in terms of capital expenses, over the past weekend, we saw a $120 billion round for OpenAI, the largest AI company. Meanwhile, the biggest AI company in Europe, Mistral, had a $2 billion round. So just to give a context of like how immense the gap is. So again, our task is to rewrite the industrial strategy this morning, and this is my pleasure to welcome a wonderful panel to discuss this issue with us. I would first like to welcome on stage Martin Reiser, who just returned from many years across the world, South Asia, China, Brazil, Turkey, and is now the senior representative for European Economic Cooperation at the World Bank. I would like to invite Daniel Gros, who pretty much everyone here knows, also founder of the Ideas Lab, distinguished fellow at CEPS and director of the Institute for European Policymaking at Bocconi University. Also have the pleasure to have on stage Alicia Herrero, chief economist for Asia Pacific at Natixis and professor at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. It's also my pleasure to welcome George Papakonstantinou, who is professor at the Florence School of Transnational Governance at the EUI, and was also minister, finance minister in Greece. Thank you so much, dear panel, for joining us. So I would like to start with a question for Martin. So Martin, the World Bank basically has, for decades, accompanied structural transition across the world. And you've seen many examples of success of this economic transformation and structural transformation, and also failure. What would be the most insightful lessons that you have for us and for Europe in that context?
Thank you very much, Pierre-Alexandre, and it's a pleasure to be here. Well, the short answer would be it's probably not due to industrial policy, but let me explain. So I think from the perspective of developing countries, they welcome that we now talk about industrial policy. For many years, we said don't touch it, we don't really know how to target, etc., etc. I think we now have a more evidence-based discussion, and that should be welcome. But as Ricardo outlined, I think very well in his keynote, the countries that need industrial policy most because they have least well-functioning markets are often the least well-placed to do it well because they don't have the required market size to scale rapidly, they don't have the fiscal capacity to afford the kinds of public investments, and they don't have the government capacity required for coordination, for monitoring, and for enforcement. And so the evidence from the developing world on the success of industrial policy remains decidedly mixed. About 16 years ago, 15 years ago, I think Josh Lerner published a book called The Boulevard of Broken Dreams. And I'm afraid to say, to this day, I think there are more examples that fit in the catalog of evidence that Josh Lerner collected than in the catalog of straight successes. Now, what about China? With Alicia on this panel, I hesitate to say too much about it, but I was the country director there for a few years, so allow me a couple of comments. Clearly, China has demonstrated that if you throw the whole catalog of policies at the problem, you manage to increase your market share. The evidence is still unclear to me whether the result of that is higher productivity. It may just be a shift in global market share as a result of subsidies, and the welfare gains from that may accrue predominantly to the buyers of Chinese goods. And if China's running a trade surplus, maybe we're the main beneficiaries of this. However, for strategic reasons, China's dominance in a number of industries may be of concern, and maybe Alicia has a word to say about what that means for trade defense policies. So in conclusion, I would say the lesson from developing countries is not that industrial policy shouldn't be talked about, but that you need to think about the how, that the design of these policies is difficult, it requires high levels of capacity, it requires clear objectives, strong monitoring, and the ability to exit when it doesn't work and to adjust course. I think it also requires a sense that investments in public infrastructure that support particular industries may be a better bet than subsidies to those industries. And in that regard, it's kind of striking that Europe spends 3% on industrial or on some kind of subsidies and only less than 0.5% of GDP on funding for public R&D, for example. So maybe Europe has something to learn from that. And then finally, I think a point that Diane also made, factor markets are really important. If you're going to throw subsidies to the supply of a particular industry, but you know that labor cannot move easily, you may just generate inflation. So thinking about how flexible your supply response is going to be, and in that context, structural policies, competition policies play an important role. So let me stop there. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Martin. And you also make us think about the how. And I want to turn to Daniel here, as there's been like 3 major reports that came out over the past 18 months on the context of industrial strategy, industrial policy. Draghi report, we had Enrico Letta yesterday, and one of your report as well, together with Jean Tirole and Clément Fuenst and others, really shows us in a very critical way that Europe is doing a lot of things wrong in terms of industrial policy and essentially got itself caught in a middle technology trap. So can you help us to understand a little bit what could be done better for the future and rewrite the future of industrial strategy?
Yeah, thanks a lot. It's great to see that the Ideas Lab is growing every year, and this year will again break all records. Many thanks also for referring to our work, which actually also formed the basis of the analysis of the Draghi report, namely that Europe is actually pretty strong in what we call middle tech industries, so automotive machinery, whereas the big difference to the United States is in high tech, especially in software. And as Draghi says, in terms of productivity in industry, especially manufacturing, there's no difference between the US and Europe. So when I hear about the deindustrialization in Europe and we need to reindustrialize, I think you're marching backwards, right? This is not the problem of Europe. The problem of Europe is in the part that we are not strong of, which is not industry, which is not the middle tech industries. And unfortunately, what one hears, our industry needs cheap energy. And we have to throw a lot of money at getting industry to get cheap energy, but that's the part actually that we are already pretty strong, and that doesn't need neither public subsidies nor trade protectionism, because we have a trade surplus also. So what is missing is the part which is soft, right? Which is not industry, which is especially software and its application. And here, one has to recognize that the strength of the US in this sector has not been based on an explicit US industrial policy. It came about because there was a very competitive ecosystem which allowed the strongest companies to develop, and a very flexible ecosystem. And you remember, Diana mentioned the cost of adjustment, and that is, I think, one of the reasons why in Europe we have not developed this high-tech sector, because by nature it's a sector where things change and you need to adjust your labor cost, your labor force, your technologies and so on very quickly. So if we have a rigid labor market, then we shouldn't be surprised that we don't get lots of investment in high churn industries. So what to do? Throwing subsidies, I don't think will improve things. What we need is things that make the adjustment easier. Ideally, we all become Danish and have flexicurity, right? But that's not possible. But when we think about declining industries, then the first thing we should think about is not helping them to survive and protecting them against the bad Chinese, but how can we facilitate the adjustment? And I think that is where we should look at. And on top of that, of course, the expenditure on research and development, which I think is something like sowing seeds, right? If the government invests in R&D, that is 0.5% of GDP. It's not that it will change everything, but you sow seeds, and if they fall on fertile grounds, they can grow over time. So even with the right policy right now in the EU, we should not expect a shock, a jump start, right? What we should be is patient, say we lost 2 decades or more, and now what we need to do is we need to sow more seeds and make sure that they fall on a fertile, meaning a flexible terrain. And the rest will come on by itself, because as everybody said, we have a lot of technological and engineering talent in Europe. But these structural conditions that we should be looking at, and not saying this industry needs this many billions, that industry needs protection against the outside. But we should really look at the more longer run, at the structural conditions under which our economic system works.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Daniel. Like now to turn to Alicia and try to understand a little bit better the lessons from Asian countries, in particular China, in terms of what was successful in terms of the industrial policy. Is there anything that we can borrow? And I have a second order question as well, which is, how is Europe seen from the Asian perspective? Because when I'm in the US, it's only about China. When I'm in China, it's only about the US. And I feel like we're just watching in the middle and nobody really cares about Europe. Is that true?
Yes. Yes. So I could stop right here, but you're going to bear with me for 2 minutes. So I think, first of all, we wrote quite a few papers saying what things you shouldn't learn about China. It's not only about what you should learn about China. And it all looks as if, because you're able to choose the sectors years in advance, made in China 2025, and you throw a lot of money, 4.6%. According to the IMF, I actually think it's much more than that, which is amazingly inefficient. I kind of fully agree with that. That's how we define China's industrial policy. Actually, that's how we define what China wants us to see about their policy. Inefficient, it isn't. But because those numbers being true, they're there to do what we shouldn't be doing, i.e. support the old sectors. A lot of that money, around 70% of subsidies, go to all sectors. So that's not what you should be watching. You should be watching what they're doing with the rest. And I also don't think it's because there's razor on point on which sectors, because they actually pick all sectors. So it's not about that either, meaning new sectors. I guess anybody here could figure what are the new sectors. It's not so difficult. But I think the difference is that when they pick those sectors, again, not picking just all of the sectors, they know they have a market to support the size needed for those sectors. So this brings me to market size. Everybody knows this. I mean, I'm not going to repeat it. We need that. That's number one. And if you think China believes they have the size, believe me, they think they don't, in the sense that they do two things. First, they still have measures. We're waiting for the 2026, 2030 5-year plan, but I can only tell you there will be a lot of additional measures on single market. Single market in China, even in China, that's an issue. So it should be a much bigger issue for us. And secondly, the rest of the world, export share. Yeah? So we may be very happy with our surplus, but I have a question. Is it going to last? Okay, I have a question, if we have time. And therefore, I think we still have to push for that market share. It's not guaranteed. So having instruments, your onions, Ricardo, that are driven to help companies export is still important. I'm not talking about simple export tax breaks or things like that, but you can think of things that would make companies think about continuing to export. I think that's very important. On innovation, I think China's industrial policy is totally linked, innovation to industrial policy, in the sense that, and it's not only money, it's not only subsidies. There is a little bit of that. R&D is subsidized, so you pay less tax if you do R&D, but smarter ways. You link, this is the 10,000 Little Giants, we wrote a big paper on that. It's very clear. You get, you get access to listing. This is key for us to scale our company. So if you innovate, we help you list. And where are our markets? Neuermark, where's that? Where's all of these markets we had for this in Europe? China has even newer markets. Hong Kong created a market recently for tech. So, we are missing that link, helping companies list and have a benefit for innovation, which goes beyond subsidies. Education, I finish here. This is just breaking news nearly in China. PhDs, how do we become PhDs in Europe? Okay, listen to this one. You can innovate, you can create a product in China now, and you get a PhD. This is so, you need to adapt your education also if you want to innovate. It's not only about subsidies, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't do industrial policy. And to Ricardo's point, and I finish here, when you said it's not a whether, it's a how, I would say for small companies, maybe it's a whether because they can't afford it, but Europe is not on that camp, and if we continue to think we're too small, It's just because we're not seeing, how we would look at ourselves, nation versus EU level. So starting to think, okay, we're big enough to compete, no matter those graphs, which are absolutely true, but the point is we should be there. We're not. Why are we not there? But starting by saying we should be there is a different story than saying we can't make it. I just can't accept that as a European. I leave it there.
Wonderful. So we finished on, thank you. we started with, yes, indeed, from the vantage point of China, Europe doesn't matter. Yet we finished on a point of optimism, so I appreciate it. I'd like now to turn to George. So when we think about what to do in terms of industrial strategy, there is absolutely no shortage of ideas, right? I mean, we have like 3 fantastic reports and so much more. We have a lot of unsuccessful policies. Ricardo was mentioning that. We also have a lot of underfunded policies and a lot of policies that basically don't stick. So based on your experience, both as an economist, as a minister, how to turn these great ideas and economic thinking and bold economic thinking into actual policy that stick, that will be there for quite a while.
Thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to be here. Last night over drinks, a friend of mine reminded me that in the mid-90s, when we were both at the OECD, I used to be responsible for a publication called the Annual Review of Industrial Policies. So I had forgotten, it's 35 years ago. I was a younger economist at the time, and it was, I guess at the time, industrial policies were respectable enough that an organization like the OECD would actually produce an annual report. Then things changed. The economics profession kind of retreated into the idea that all we need to do is framework conditions, get the framework conditions right, and then the rest will follow. Now, governments continue to do industrial policy throughout this. They didn't abandon it. I think, for example, for the US, we need to disabuse ourselves from the idea that, it's a fantastic private ecosystem. A lot of it is based on massive government contracts. A lot of them come from the defense sector. And this is how a lot of the advance of the US in high tech is here today. Europe continued industrial policy, sometimes under the radar, sometimes successfully and in a big way. Airbus was an example. Less successful example like Minitel. Many people that are French in this room may remember that. Okay, so here we are today, where industrial policy is back, front and center. Clearly, it has to do with the geopolitical competition that is going on. And my remarks are going to be about Europe as a whole and not about national industrial policy. So a good starting point is to remind ourselves that we're great at diagnosing stuff. Right? In Europe, we're really good at that. Okay? We have fantastic ideas, we write great reports, and we're really bad at implementation. We're really bad at making these practical. So why is that? And I'm going to focus on 4 things. Hopefully, sort of, I will be picking things from what others have said and hopefully taking it a little bit further. The first one is financing at scale. So the US has had recently the Inflation Reduction Act, IRA, massive financing for a new wave of technologies that are important. China has had its own system. We rely on national efforts and fragmented programs. We do not understand the concept of how to finance European public goods centrally. Well, even if they're financed centrally, they can be produced nationally, but coming into a system. Think of how during COVID, we completely left out European public goods from the Next Generation EU, and we relied on national plans exclusively. So that's the first point. Second point is governance. We know that industrial policy is connected, and Diane mentioned this, with competition policy, trade policy, state aid rules, R&D funding, energy policy, education policy. And yet we don't connect the internal and the external. And this is why the simultaneous publication of the Letter report and the Draghi report are important, because the Letter report is internal, the Draghi report is external, and connecting the two is very important. You cannot talk about industrial policy without talking about completion of the internal market, without talking about the safe assets, without talking about liquid capital markets for Europe. So that means the need, governance means the need for coordination around a number of strategic priorities. Third point is credibility and strategic clarity. We're trying to find a positioning for Europe between decoupling on the one hand and naive openness on the other hand. So we've developed all these ideas, de-risking, strategic autonomy. We're still trying to understand exactly what they mean. In here, what we're missing is some of the long-term demand signals that a number of people mentioned. Procurement is very important here. Industry needs long-term security to be able to invest in areas, and governments are supposed to give it that security, and we don't give that long-term perspective. Finally, on this issue, I think the Draghi report is very important because for the first time, it went to the idea of missions around very specific questions and sectors. I had never in my life before seen an EU-level report that was so granular in terms of how it approached things. And I think that in itself shows that we have changed our attitude to these things. Final point, the political economy, which is very important in how we go about. You need to build constituencies around these things. If you don't build them as governments, they will be built by themselves, and they're going to be protective constituencies that try to keep subsidies in declining industries where we should no longer be investing. So the political economy of reform, the political economy of industrial policy or strategy is very important. And there, to be able to get it, you need some leadership in terms of national leaders willing to say, okay, I will not look very, very narrowly at my national interest, but be part of a European effort where I will make some allowances for the fact that my country is not going to be taking the biggest piece of the pie. And unfortunately, we don't see very much of that at the moment. I'll stop here.
Thank you so much. Wonderful. Thank you, George. Just would like to come back really quickly on one thing, which is that indeed Europe is missing on the very top key high-tech sectors. And also going back to what Diana was saying in terms of AI, isn't that an opportunity for Europe to catch up? Because indeed, Europe is nowhere in terms of software, but also we see that the software stocks and the SaaS world has been doing really, really bad last year. Like going down in an era where the stock market has been growing very, very quickly. And while software ate the world, we see that now AI is eating software. So we also have an opportunity maybe to catch up in that respect. However, one of the big issues here that we haven't mentioned that much is also investment, private capital. So we discussed the deal of OpenAI with like 120 billion, but like this is really something that where Europe is missing in terms of unleashing this private investment. And we have the size, the money is there, the size of the market is there, but somehow we still don't see the private investment flowing into the new startups. And I want to lead to one round of questions for all of our panel speakers on like this rewriting of the future industrial strategy and like one bold action. So imagine the friction don't exist. Imagine there is political acceptance for your bold idea. What would be the one action that you think will really make a huge difference? And I'm going to start, while you think about it, I'm going to start just to give an idea of what I have in mind. One of the biggest issues in Europe is that we don't have pension funds. We don't have pension funds to the scale of the US. And if you look at where the private capital comes from, for the high-tech technologies companies, for the startups in the US, it's mainly from VCs, and these VC funds are funded mainly by pension funds. So the whole way our pension system are structured does not allow capital to flow to the startups that become the big companies of tomorrow. So this is really one of the essential problems that if we cannot tackle, it's not a footnote, it's the elephant in the room, according to me, for instance. So if you give me a magic wand to rewrite the future of industrial strategy, I start by changing the way we structure our pension system in Europe. Just to give you an example. Now, is that going to be easy as a French person? No. And when I talk to some colleagues in government, it's like, okay, well, this is political suicide. You know, don't touch les retraites. No, don't touch that. You have like strike for 6 months. So I'm not saying there is no friction, but like in terms of like big problem with like a massive solution and a massive upside, in my case, that would be like my one wish and my one dream, let's say, to rewrite the future of industrial strategy. So I would like now to turn to our panel and just ask you this one question. What would be your wish, like this one bold action if we could rewrite industrial strategy without friction?
Well, I think you need an organization. It's not just policies. You need an organization that actually manages things. Maybe it's an existing organization that you empower it with that. Maybe it's a new organization. But you need, it cannot be summit after summit and then nothing happens in between. There has to be an organization that learns and that is delegated some authority over some funds. It has to assure that these funds are an investment and not expenditure, that they will come back to engross the budgets of the member countries and the union, and that can try things out and accumulate experience. Nobody knew how to run monetary policy at the European level. Now you have an organization that is able to run monetary policy at the European level. They have learned a lot, they have accumulated a lot of experience, they have accumulated capabilities. I think without an organization behind this effort, I don't think that you're going to get very far.
So I might come from left field on this and say that in the current context, either Paris or London ought to invite Anthropic to relocate to Europe.
Sorry, I didn't hear.
Yeah, what I said is that we should invite Anthropic to come.
I'll take inspiration from what Alicia said about the forthcoming 5-year plan in China and say Europe should work on a better integrated energy market. One of the key challenges that China has in the fragmentation. I think it'll bring energy costs down. It's something that can be done European-wide, and it's consistent with the principle that you should first look at, do you have the public ecosystem, the infrastructure to support the kind of industrial investments you want to make, and there's lots to do. Not that this is politically easy, perhaps slightly easier than pension reform, which I would have put top of my list, but since you mentioned it, I had to choose something else.
I would also support the pension reform. I think this is really key. And actually, I think there are ways to have it gradually introduced that could minimize, but that is something else. We have assumed that away. I would flank that with some targeted flex security in the labor market. Let's say for highly qualified people, for highly paid people, because I repeat, in the fast-growing high-tech sectors, you have a very lot of adjustment costs, right? Some parts work 1 year, the next year something else. You need to be able to fire 1,000 engineers and hire 2,000 others, right? And therefore, targeted, if you want flex security, of course, supported by general retraining and very high educational standards, that would, in the long run, have a big impact.
I have two, very quickly. So first is digital infrastructure. I mean, you were saying we now have to integrate our energy system. What about integrating our digital infrastructure before we actually all create our own data centers? I mean, it seems to me that, you know, if we miss that one, we'll be in big trouble. That's one. And second is, what about looking at the age of our companies? Yeah, I mean, they're old, sorry. Chinese companies are younger, at least forget about SOEs, but, you know, American companies, if you look at, you know, who is actually innovating. These are, by the way, whoever thinks this is only about startups, I'm sorry, it is not. It's about the big companies. Those are the companies that are innovating in critical technology in the US or China. Ping An, for example, an insurance company has more radical patents in AI than literally probably any European company except Ericsson and ECA. So that's it. So we need big companies, but new companies, modern companies in the right new sector. So for me, I mean, I know we have to get there, but I don't think it's only about VCs, and no. I think the existing companies need to have incentives to switch somehow. You can think about, nearly dying telecom companies. Some of those telecom companies are the largest innovators elsewhere in the world, especially in China, Huawei. So why not? Why don't we have the right? So just to end, I think we need to think of about our big companies. Who are they? What are they doing? Why are they not in the right sectors? What can we do to help them? Yeah.
I have two as well, but one is borrowed, so that's okay. The first one is to basically do, because we have to be operational here, right? Yesterday, Enrico Letta gave us a very operational goal, which is to pass a one market bill. This would be our equivalent of the US Big Beautiful Bill, which brings together connectivity, savings investment union, and energy union, right? If we pass these three through an interindustrial agreement, that would be a major step forward that completes the internal market and therefore helps very much competitiveness. And so that's the first thing. The second would be completely different, which is that I would find 3 to 5 very narrowly granular priorities in key sectors across AI, clean tech, energy, and then announce a kind of moon-type approach where you put up a prize and then you have people compete against each other, and therefore through that you subsidize, it's not a dirty word, subsidize through competition successful companies to get to a place where you want to go.
Wow, wonderful. Thank you so much. I don't know about you, but I feel like there's a lot of great ideas that came out. I'm going to take notes and re-watch and take notes because that was really, really insightful on how to rewrite this industrial strategy. So I'd like now to move to the audience Q&A. We have mics here with Gaia and Hannah. So yeah, well, right here, please.
Hi, my name is Anna Kolesnichenko. I work for CEPS. And my question is, first of all, to Ricardo Hausmann, but then to everyone else. So government, when it invests, it also often invests in things which are less tangible, like skills, etc. So when you are talking about this positive NPV approach, how would you apply this to less tangible assets? Second question, we always look with this, I don't know, envy at China, but we basically, why don't we look at the ways that how they finance their innovation and maybe adopt some of their strategies? And the key to their innovation scale up is government venture funds, which blend like all sorts of government finance with private risk-taking. And so I think for Europe, maybe this is a more promising model than American model of venture capital. What would you say on this? And this would perfectly fit the approach that Ricardo proposes of having net returns for the government. In this case, the government is the owner of the asset.
Great, thank you. And I would just ask you to pick one of the two questions, and if you can be very short, so we can have more questions for the audience. Thank you.
I think, I mean, education is a very good example of something that is probably net present value positive for the government. If you just do the calculation, you know, with Mincer regressions of what you get in terms of extra wages and all the taxes that the person pays over the course of their lifetime. So but I think precisely if we had that organization, it would develop all the tools and techniques to score things. And it will, we need to score all the soft things and especially all the cheap soft things because they can be super, I mean, I think that the one single bill, beautiful bill, probably has a super high net present value for the governments of the region, right? And finally, I want to say something about venture capital. It's not just the money, it's the knowledge and how to deploy it. And it's accumulating in organizations that know how to deploy the money. And that is, I think, where we should focus.
Beautiful. I think Lucio had a question.
Impressive panel with lots of former colleagues. I'm Lucio Vinhas de Souza, the Chief Economist of Business Europe and the Director of its ECOFIN department. I'm also a former European Union official, and one thing that I have to tell when I hear about you is a misunderstanding of the capacities of government, right? So governments need targeted specific priorities. Believe you me, you certainly know that, George, governments need 1, 2, 3 things to do, and that's about it. Otherwise, they don't do anything. So my plea here, I'm also a great fan of the notion of the one single bill, because a lot of what we have been talking about effectively is how do we go about completing the single market on labor, on capital, on investment. So that's the overriding priority. You can hide complexity under it, the 170 things that we have on the Draghi report, but that's the one single priority. How do we operationalize that, which has really net positive returns in terms of the way that we operationalize things here in the EU? So the real question for me is that is the priority. How do we complete the single market? How do we actually go about it in terms of really implementing it this time? I think that's the key question for us.
Thank you. Anyone would like to add something to this?
Well, I think sometimes I have the impression that we are really besides reality, in the sense that we all know, everybody says, every national leader says, I'm all for the internal market. Then he has to go home, and he or she has to make concrete decisions. Do I confront this or that domestic political opposition because Europe will gain? Now, I'm an economist. I don't believe, I believe in people act in their self-interest. And every day he says, okay, now maybe not yet, right? So that will not come about unless we find a way to have some, in specific areas, some federal European institutions that take then care of certain issues. So that you at the national level don't have the duty every day to make a decision that goes, my European, whatever, feeling, fuzzy feeling against the actual. And the second point is, we are talking here about big principles on industrial policy. The reality right now is there's strong pressure in Europe everywhere to get energy subsidies. Yeah. Right? But that's the reality. That's where the big money is. Yeah. And I think the first instance is, as you said, not to make mistakes. The first instance is to say no. And that's what the European institutions are there for. So I think it's a very grubby task, but it's essential, because if we go down that road with industrial subsidies, industrial energy subsidies, then we favor the old industries and all the rest is just talk.
Thank you. I think we had two last questions, one here and one by Andrea.
Thank you very much. My name is Karen Melchior. I'm a former Danish diplomat and Danish MEP. I think we should all be more Danish. I think that would be great. And it is possible. I mean, we're only 5 million, but if it's possible in Denmark, it should be possible other places. But how do we have an industrial strategy that allows our societies to become less rigid? Because a lot of the problems is that we're stuck in status quo. And as you just mentioned, old industries are stuck in their ways and don't want to change. Our country's national economic settings don't want to change. That's why we don't have the internal market. So how do we become more flexible? Because if we just look at the Airbus model, that's not going to work, because then we just protected industries that were already existing and put them together. So how do we force our political system, our industries, our economies to become less rigid, more flexible, more Danish?
I mean, I'm wondering, this is a bit of an outside perspective. I do hold an EU passport, but I've lived abroad for so many years that I don't trust my instinct here. But is there a scope for, if we all want to be more Danish, there's quite a few countries in Europe that are quite similar to Denmark, Sweden, Estonia. You know, if coalitions of the willing could form around Denmark's to show the way, maybe you would get some of the scale without having to bring everybody on board. I am told by Enrico Letta that the Single Market Act actually doesn't require consensus, it just requires majority rule. So maybe this is possible even within the single market. But I'm wondering whether we're trying to solve too many problems and whether coalitions of the willing might be a solution.
Can I just add one sentence, which is make more opportunities for young people. Young people have completely different attitudes compared to old folks like me.
Yeah, just continue on that. aside from the mechanics of how we get things done in Europe, and I'm all in for correlations of the willing, there is a fundamental underlying problem, which is that a big segment of the population in Europe feels that they're not part of what's happening. So unless and until you do that, then you can do all the engineering up in the top. So there's issues of inequality that are very important, there's issues of public service that are not being done. So if we don't address those, we won't be able to do the rest.
Wonderful, thank you. And maybe like some closing words from Andrea, a closing statement, a question.
Yeah, no, we are over time, so I just want to congratulate all the panelists and say one thing and one remark. See if someone wants to respond, otherwise we go for a coffee break and we continue the conversation bilaterally. I think two things that we've learned over the past years, especially during the pandemic, is learning to prepare, right? We had Sauli Niinisto yesterday, we had the preparedness report. And now also following Ricardo's input at the beginning, I think governments have to prepare to learn. And if you want to prepare to learn, because reality is constantly changing, you need to have the capabilities to observe what is around you, right? So I was wondering whether, since you talk about an organization, whether European institutions currently have those capabilities or have invested sufficiently in those capabilities. One is the famous critical tech observatory that the GRTD has been working on for a long time, the work on economic complexity. And so all the work that revolves around not only on the whether or the how, but also on the where. And I think this is where a lot of the economic tools and the data that we're using today give us a much better situational awareness. So my plea would be for European institutions, and CEPS would certainly support that, to increase that level of situational awareness through better data, better use of economic tools, more advanced economic tools, and a way for us to give the North Star to each and every region of Europe, because they will have different capabilities that can evolve into different frontiers. And so the work of statisticians, data governance that Diane was evoking, the organization and governance that Ricardo was talking about, I think these are all things which should roll up our sleeves and work on. And it's not about reinventing something completely new. It's actually doing the job of the government. And that is, I think, it might seem like a fairly straightforward conclusion, but it's not. In Brussels, it's not. I was hearing Lucio's question and that reminded me that Lucio was in a think tank of the Juncker Commission, the current European Commission. You could say, could it have been better? Probably, but it was a center of knowledge and expertise. It doesn't exist anymore. I mean, IDEA doesn't really replace in the European Political Strategy Center, and I think I would improve on the European Political Strategy Center if possible, but I think we need to think about it carefully.
Thank you so much, Andrea. Unfortunately, we have to close this session. Please, we at 11, so in 10 minutes, we have the parallel session starting. But before that, please join me in thanking again our wonderful panel speakers.